Well, thank you very much, Heinz, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I send greetings from the saints of Calvary Chapel, Lynchburg, where I have my home church. So it's delightful to start off my series of talks here in the Pacific Northwest with a fellow CC church. So it's been a great transition for our family to attend CC Lynchburg, and we've really enjoyed it. As Heinz had mentioned, my background is in geology. I'm a paleontologist, so I frequently would say, I'm a fossils and rocks guy. And let me just get this looking less like just, background screen here. I taught at Liberty University from 2005 to 2021, where I was the fossils and rocks guy on campus. That's what I did. I taught courses in earth science, geology, vertebrate paleontology, which is my particular specialty. That's studying, the fossils of animals that have bones, as opposed to invertebrate paleontology, the fossils of shelly sorts of things and whatnot. And I also got to teach a course in creation studies. So one of the main duties that I had as a professor was teaching Creation Studies 290, which was our History of Life class. I also taught an advanced course in creation studies. So if creation studies is the sort of thing that is really of interest to you, Liberty University has some really good courses and some great professors in the sciences, in the School of Divinity, in the religion program. Their engineering folks, very, very strong across the board. The school has a very, very strong commitment to creation, which is why I wanted to go there and teach. My own background, K through PhD in state-run public schools. You never get a whoop whoop from the public school kids. If I mention that we homeschool our kids, public school kids are like, yeah. I did learn this about being a homeschool dad. There is a song for everything. Everything. In public school, we didn't sing. Even if they told us to, we wouldn't sing. There was nothing to sing about. There was a math test coming up. They would give us a moment to pray about that, even in the public schools. They were like, fine, it's okay, we understand. Everybody needs some help. But I was K through PhD in the state schools. Going to a Christian school wasn't a financial possibility for my family when I was young, and homeschooling wasn't like a thing that we knew about in Rhode Island, and my mom, I think I would agree with her when she would say, you didn't want me schooling you. And I was, yeah, probably not. That would not be in her gifting, not what she wanted to do. But despite the fact that my dad only went to some college and my mom dropped out of high school, later to get her GED, the two kids that they had ended up getting PhDs. So we learned that education was important. I don't know how it got drilled into us that the final degree is what you need to get before we can count this all, but we both did that, myself in geology and paleontology and my sister in theology. So we have two Dr. Rosses in our family, and it's really neat. She ended up working at Liberty University as well, and it lives 3 blocks from our house, and my parents live a couple of blocks further than that. So we're all together, growing up in Rhode Island, but I pulled them all in with grandchildren. All right, yeah, that's how we got the grandparents in. We got grandchildren, and then my sister, we just somehow snagged her. Going through K through PhD in state schools meant that my own perspectives on Earth's history, grounded in what I think is the truth of the statements of the Bible about our planet's history and heritage, were quite at odds with everything that I was taught. Now, growing up in the 1980s, as I did, Gen X. That's right, we Gen Xers. There's 8 of us here. Nobody's ever cared about us. We all know that, but that's why we're bitter, right? That's why we had that angsty period in the 90s. But anyway, you guys don't understand. You're sandwiched between the boomers and the millennials, and you're in the middle of X, and everybody knows nobody cares about us, nor will they. It's okay. We're used to it. We were the latchkey kids, right? So growing up in the public schools, I was never taught anything in regards to Earth history that comported with what I thought the scriptural account was. Now, growing up in the 80s as I did, also teaching of like evolution and the age of the Earth wasn't a big thing. It wasn't pushed very hard. That would kind of come later on as challenges to conventional evolutionary theory would come up and rise, and teachers groups and science teachers associations would start pushing back and saying, we need more of this stuff. We need more evolution, more old age stuff in there. I kind of skated through without seeing very much of it until I went to college. And then, well, I went from Rhode Island and I went to Penn State University for my undergrad, and went through my first year of geology classes, Geology 1, Geology 2, and some other ones, and realized I'm a young Earth creationist by conviction, but I don't really know a whole lot. And because it was the dawn of the internet, literally people, like my freshman year, the internet began as a thing. The only thing out there were stories about Boba Fett at the beginning. It was weird. Because what happens when nerds start communicating with one another? They talk Star Wars. They laugh because they know it's true, right? And we're still talking Star Wars because we rule. So it wasn't until that first year that I kind of realized I'm going to have to learn a whole lot more. I learned a few things here and there, but there wasn't an internet. Growing up in New England, it wasn't exactly some bastion of evangelicalism up there. Everybody I knew was Catholic. And like the Pope said, evolution's fine, so like nobody had a problem. So what was my deal? So I came back home from college that year and I ordered the Henry Morris Pack from Christian Book Distributors. Some of you remember good old CBD, still up, but back when CBD meant something entirely different. Their website used to be cbd.com. They held on to that for a little while. I'm sure they sold it at a good price, but they're now christianbook.com. And so I got as many books as I can. I started learning. I started reading about geology not only from a conventional standpoint, but also from a creationist standpoint, a young Earth creationist standpoint. And I would take courses in paleontology and geochemistry and a whole bunch of other sorts of stuff inside geology that you would think, like, isn't geology just like one thing? You're like, actually, no, there's like, 12 disciplines, 15 disciplines inside geology. What do you want to go with? And you have to sample those in your undergraduate, of course. From there, I graduated, and I was still a young Earth creationist. My my undergraduate advisor knew I was a young Earth creationist. He had actually even debated Duane Gish back in the 1970s. It wasn't a good experience for him, both because Gish was a consummate debater, but also because he faced a very hostile crowd on his own campus territory, and he was not expecting that. So that soured him a little bit, but by the time I came along, water had been under the bridge, and he taught me geology, he taught me paleontology, and I still came out as a young Earth creationist. He was okay with that. That was Roger Cuffey. From there, I would go on to get a master's degree in paleontology in the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. That's where things got rough. Very, very rough. But the Lord saw me through that, and I went back to my home state of Rhode Island to do a PhD, studying a group of animals called mosasaurs. How many of you watched Jurassic World? Okay, yeah, more hands ought to go up for that one. The paleontologist is up here. Anyway, if you haven't watched Jurassic Park, consider that homework. You need to go watch a movie where people have to run away from dinosaurs. I mean, just keep it basic. We remember Godzilla, that was good, this is better. It's got Chris Pratt and some kids in a gerbil ball. I mean, it's weird. So I went back to my home state of Rhode Island. I studied mosasaurs. Those are in Jurassic Park. That was the marine thing that comes up out of the water and eats the shark and eventually eats a secretary. She didn't deserve to die, but whatever. That's Hollywood. And all through this time, I have to process and think about geology from the standpoint of an evolutionary paleontologist. None of my training was as a creationist. In fact, all of my training was directly hostile to this view. And some of the people I met along the way were very hostile towards this view and towards me. Other people, like my PhD advisor in particular, they knew I was a young Earth creationist, but as long as I was willing to do the work the way that they thought it needed to be done, they're like, hey, no problem. We can work with that. I'm like, okay, all right, we'll give it a try. But it meant also that I had to think about being a creationist when I'm being faced with all of this data and all of these different arguments for an ancient age of the Earth, for biological evolution. And Make no mistake, you don't hear creationists say this very often, but I will. The evidence for an ancient earth is powerful. And the evidence for evolution, to many people, is quite compelling. I don't think that it's correct. I don't think that an ancient age of the earth is correct. But far too often we underestimate those who think these things. And as a result, we can get ourselves into trouble sometimes. And it's when you go into a deep dive in any particular subject that you start really seeing, where the weeds are and what's in it. So this talk that I have here is about thinking what happens after the flood is done. What happens when the flood is over and Noah has to come out into a world that is in many ways quite alien to the one that he left just a year beforehand? And so we'll think about this, and we'll think about a few things in regard to the fossil record and the geological record. So the topics that we're going to explore: a little bit about biblical history, the geological record and time. Then we're going to be thinking about biology after the flood, and then put that in the context also of what's going on with the Ice Age after the flood. And you've had some excellent speakers in the past that have been brought in, like Mike Oward, who is quite expert on issues about the Ice Age. I'll be playing off of some of that. So biblical history, geology, and time. So one thing to recognize is that the biblical argument for the flood's totality is not simply limited to all the high hills under the whole heavens. There's actually a lot going on in the text. And because I have a Hebraist and an Old Testament scholar for a sister, she keeps feeding me a whole bunch of books that otherwise I would have never read in my life. Because I'm the science guy. I'm not the Hebrew guy. And she's like, doesn't matter, you have to read this person. And even though she's my younger sister, I listen. Because I'm that kind of brother. So the flood's destruction was universal for humanity, and it was what we would now call global in scope. I actually often don't use the word global around theologians because they start getting all twitchy, like, hey, nobody knew it was a globe, like whatever. Worldwide, how's that? All right? You got to be careful with some of the folks. They get twitchy. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament authors are in complete agreement between the Testaments that all the people on earth, except for Noah and the family that were brought on board the ark, were killed outside. We see this repeated multiple times in Genesis 7. And if you read through Genesis 7, it does sometimes, you reach a section of it that really seems overly repetitive to us as modern readers. And part of that is because we are modern readers. Most of the Israelites, remember, are hearing this. And how, parents in the audience, how do you build emphasis for your kids? What? 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 Yeah, that's right. Repeat it. Say it again. My mom told me I had to take the trash out every day. Didn't always do that. And so I faced an angry mom at the end of the day. How many days do you have to take out the trash, Marcus? Every day. Mom, which one of those days do I have to take the trash out? Every one of them ends in day. Right. So when we read about all these things dying, and people dying, and waters rising more, and people dying, and waters rising, and things dying, and here's all the different things that are dying, and all those things that I just said, we're going to say them again, they're dead again, the waters got bigger, right? You start, as a modern reader, you're like, I get it. But if you're a hearer, this is exactly what you need. Because praise God, the Bible is not written with bold italics and, heaven forbid, emojis to get our points across. Somebody will make an emoji Bible. Somebody will do it. But we also see that in the New Testament, in 1 Peter, 2 Peter, 3 Peter. Not 3 Peter, sorry. 3 times in the 2 Peters. Once in 1 Peter and twice in 2 Peter. The flood is also directly compared to 2 universal events. When we jump forward into the scriptures and take a look at 2 Peter, where Peter writes extensively about this in response to skeptics of Jesus' resurrection that are coming to the church and saying, dead people stay dead, by the way. It's been this way since the beginning. Everything always has continued from the beginning, ever since our fathers fell asleep. And Peter says, no. It's not like that. And they are willfully ignorant, because these skeptics are not like Greeks. These skeptics are Jewish people talking to Jewish Christians and saying Jesus isn't coming back. And Peter says, no, because they willingly forget that by the word of God, the heavens and the earth were made out of water, creation. And by these same waters, the world at that time was deluged and destroyed. And because of that, we can know that Jesus' return is coming, and it will be different the next time, of course, because we have a promise that the world would not be flooded again. So we have two completely universal events, the creation of everything and the redemption of everything, the final judgment of all. And sitting right in the middle, as evidence for the truth of this going to happen, is that God has done universal judgment in the past. And they ought to know that, because they're Jewish. Now, the geological record, and we handed out these, and if you didn't get one, we have plenty of them out on the table in the back. They're free for you guys to take. This is a translation guide, if you will. It shows an illustration in the center of what we call the geological column. That is all those layers of rocks with funny names. We know Jurassic because we know movies. I had to memorize this. I had to memorize all the dates that were on it. And I just put a couple on here. You will not be so quizzed, you will not be so abused by me in this way. But then these things get divided up into even smaller increments, and I had to memorize some of those dates, and I would make my students do it because this is what teachers do. They make their students do the same painful things that they were told to do. It's our form of revenge. Now, on either side of that illustration here are two possible interpretations. There may be others, right? Who knows how many interpretations there might be, but we have two. One, on the left-hand side, shows the ages in the conventional hundreds of millions, billions of years. This is how the world of geology views this record. On the other side is a perspective on this same group of rocks that can be organized in the context of a young Earth creation, a global flood, and the time after the flood in which geology is happening. What rocks were made during creation week? Do we have any? Do we know? How might we know? And that's a talk for a different time, but at least getting us thinking about this, right? That the geological column with all of these funny names in them, like Ordovician, or Oligocene, or Eocene, or Pennsylvanian, this is a representation of real geological relationships, that there are fossils in certain layers of rock. So let's take Jurassic, because we know that one, right? We've heard of Jurassic. The dinosaurs that are assigned to the Jurassic layers are things like Allosaurus, Stegosaurus, Brontosaurus, which, actually might be a thing again. It was gone for a while, but it might be a thing again. Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, Camptosaurus, there's a whole bunch. Right? That's the classic stuff out of, say, the Morrison Formation here in the United States. Cretaceous dinosaurs are different. There's Jurassic, there's certain dinosaurs, and we assign these types of dinosaurs, when they're found together into rocks, we call those rocks Jurassic. T-Rex is not found amongst those fossils. When we find T-Rex and Allosaurus anywhere nearby, T-Rex is in rocks that are vertically above the Allosaurus. They were buried sequentially in some way. Allosaurus and its group were buried first, and T-Rex and its group were buried later. Okay? And we can trace these relationships all up and down the North American continent, along the Rocky Mountains, all over the place. So this is a representation of real relationships. You may have heard people say that the geological column, right, the fossils date the rocks and the rocks date the fossils, and it's circular reasoning. It's not true. It's not true. And my specialty in paleontology was actually in how this sort of stuff gets constructed, what we call biostratigraphy, which is using fossils to trace our way up and down in rocks. So this is something I was very, very intimately connected with. We see that there are historical shifts that happen. If we go back to, sorry. I don't know why that's there. That's actually really weird. Historical shifts in the way that people viewed it. If we were to ask a early scientist, they would have been called a naturalist in the 1700s, what is the origin of these rocks, most of them would probably say something like God created things during creation week, or a lot of the rocks were formed during the flood. There would be some that would start saying, well, I don't know about how old the earth is. Maybe there were things that were happening before the creation week or something. But that would be like the 1700s. By the time we get to the 1800s, a significant shift had happened, and most people that were thinking about geology were thinking about geology in terms of an ancient age. But one rock cannot have two different ages to it, right? Those rocks that are Jurassic are either 160 million years old, or they are a few thousands of years old. Those are the two options that we kind of have on the table. And there really aren't very many others that have been proposed out there. So the column, as a representation of the way that rocks are organized and stacked and layered upon one another around the world, those are the data. And we as Christians can affirm that because this is simply the way the world actually is out there. This is anything that we can go and look for ourselves. On either side, however, we have interpretations of those data. And we can disagree with interpretations, but we don't want to disagree with actual raw data that you can go see, right? That becomes a problem. So I would submit that we have 3 periods of time in which there was major geologic activity in the earth. The first is going to be in creation week, down towards the bottom of that stack. Why the bottom? Well, because gravity works. Short answer. I'm a messy guy. My desk is not well kept. It's very true. So if I want to try to think about something like, oh, I had a client call in and they wanted me to check on something I hadn't looked at in a little while, I start digging, right? I start going down. Because some of you are like, oh, no, don't tell me. It's okay. I'm not going to show you a picture of the desk, okay? I'm not going to pull the ADD problems out on this one. So my desk, a colleague used to say, I have a 4-dimensional filing system. Length, width, depth, and time. Time's really important because the more recent it was, the higher up on the stack it's going to be. And the older it was, the further down in the stack it's going to be. And in my stacks, there's also geological events like faults and slumps and folds and stuff, right? It's all very delicately balanced. So in geology, you can't have Cretaceous rocks sitting upon nothing waiting for Jurassic rocks to form. Jurassic rocks have got to form and sit down so that you can lay more stuff on top of it, right? So this is a very simple principle that was first understood in terms of geology in the 1600s. So we have creation weeks down at the bottom, and these creation week rocks, I should say, are characterized by the fact that there's basically no large-scale organisms of any kind in them. There's no animal fossils in them until you get to the very, very top where I think we actually start the flood. But, basically you've got bacteria, you've got some other single-celled organisms, you've got some fungi and things like that. You've got very simple sorts of things that probably need to be around during creation week, right? When God is creating an ocean that is going to be habitable, he's going to need microbes in it that are going to be able to produce things like oxygen. But God apparently doesn't consider them to be alive in quite the same way that he talks about the nephesh creatures, the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the creeping things, right? Those categories of organisms are not part of what we find inside these rocks. Instead, these rocks are mostly igneous and metamorphic, crystalline rocks with a very minimal type of groups of fossils in them, and nothing that looks like complex life. Apologies to the microbiologists, all life is complex, but some life is far more complicated. Then we have a significant amount of the geological record that was formed during Noah's flood. Now, on the card that you have, my proposal here is that the flood covers the very top of the red all the way up through at least the green.
Did you want those handed out?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. You'll get one of these, now or later. We'll have them at the table, but thank you, Pastor. Appreciate that. So these rocks, broadly speaking, young Earth creationists are in agreement that at least this group of rocks are part of what was formed during the flood. We actually do have a very significant disagreement within young Earth creationism about how high up in the rock record the flood goes. I think that it ends somewhere around the end of the dinosaurs. Other people think that it ends way up close just before the Ice Age. And we have our fights and our academic nerd battles and whatnot about that sort of thing. But nonetheless, we still all are in agreement that there are creation week rocks, there are flood rocks, and there are post-flood rocks. And I would submit that the dinosaurs probably represent the end point of the flood thereabouts, maybe a little bit into the yellow, but most of the yellow unit is going to be the post-flood period, characterized primarily by the, what we call the age of mammals. Frequently called that, it's the Cenozoic. Now, there's a lot more than mammals in the Cenozoic. There's all sorts of reptiles and birds and amphibians and insects and whatnot, but the vertebrate fossil record is dominated by things like mammals. And not all of the mammals are all found in all the layers either. You get different sorts of mammals if you're in this bottom unit called the Paleocene or the Eocene than you get in things like the Pliocene and the Pleistocene. And when you're in the Pleistocene, you're in the Ice Age, and you've got woolly mammoths and mastodons, and you've got saber-toothed tigers and ground sloths and things like that. The ground sloths are actually in South America. They decided to move north. We sent cats down to South America. It's actually something called the Great Faunal Interchange, the Great American Faunal Interchange, and it's kind of wild. That movie Ice Age, and 2, 3, 5, 12, whatever they're on right now. They actually get it pretty right when they have the different sorts of mammals on that show. I love Ice Age. It's great. So it seems then that the created world was somewhat different, that the flood completely reshaped the world, because the sorts of things that we see in the fossil record are not all the same sorts of things that we see wandering around the Earth today. There's significant differences. And it even seems that the geography, the location of continents and ocean basins was radically different in the past. The created world, the world that Adam and Eve knew, the world that Noah knew when he first got on board the ark. But the world that he entered afterwards looked markedly different, and probably not even quite like the modern geography. Close, but not quite there yet either. Now, of course, in the biblical record, we have genealogies that kind of move us through time to get us an idea that human history and world history coincide. Right? Adam is made on the 6th day. Those days are regular days. We don't have time to discuss that. That's not our topic for today. But nonetheless, there's different ages that you could, posit for how much time between Adam and Noah. If you use the Hebrew version of of what's called the Masoretic text, that's the basis for most all of our Bibles, you get 1,600 and some odd years between the two of them. The Septuagint, which was the first translation of the Hebrew into Greek, actually has different numbers. And then the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Samaritans had their own Bible of just the first 5 books. Their numbers look different too. It's a little weird. But nonetheless, we know that there's some copying errors and mistakes that have been made along the way. But nonetheless, these are not big numbers, right? This isn't millions of years or anything like that. These aren't even hundreds of thousands of years. This is a few thousand years between Adam and Noah, and a very short period of time between Noah and Abram, either a few hundred or a little over 1,000. Now, the entire story of the flood is a giant, what we call in Hebrew, a chiasm. Chiasm is like a balanced story. So I've got it here as a triangle. You start off with Noah and his sons. God promises, I'm going to destroy the earth. Noah enters the ark. The floodwaters, of course, rise, and you get the very repetitive part where everything is dying. And then the key verse for the entire narrative, the one verse you're supposed to remember above all others, is verse 1 of chapter 8. God remembered Noah. Because if God didn't, Noah wouldn't have made it either. The ark does not save him. God saves Noah. And this isn't Noah. God remembered Noah like, where did I put that guy? Man, there's a lot of water. Where's the boat? Right? This is covenantal language. This is like when God remembers Abram and Sarah and says, you are now going to have it. This is when I'm going to act on the promise that I made you. That's that remembrance that happens here. And then after that, watch what happens. The floodwaters recede. Noah eventually leaves the ark with all the animals. God promises he'll never destroy the world again with a flood. And then there's a discussion of Noah and his sons. The whole thing is nicely balanced. And it's written this way, and Lots of the Bible is actually written this way because it was actually a pretty convenient way of being able to organize a story so that if you could kind of remember what goes on in the first half, it's going to help you remember all the things that happen on the second half. Because again, most of them are hearing the word, not reading the word. And then you have a bunch of numbers that all get put in here as well. So these are the sorts of things that all point us to an understanding that the flood is a global event. So what happens after the flood? Noah gets off of the ark, and of course the giraffes are the last to leave because they've got to keep their heads sticking up out of the ark for as long as possible. Because every picture of the ark needs a couple of idiot giraffe heads sticking up out of the top of it. Giraffes are really tall. Yeah. Well, it says in Genesis 8:15 that God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh." And then it lists them. All the things that were listed as like dying, these are the things that had to be brought in, right? Birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth, that they're going to multiply like crazy, and be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Where have you heard "be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth" before? Yes, Genesis 1. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And God does the exact same thing to the man and his family and all the animals that happened in Genesis 1. Fun homework assignment after you watch Jurassic World? Open up Genesis 1 and open up Genesis 8 and read them side by side. It's going to get freaky. You're going to be like, what? Anyway, I'm just going to leave that with you. Don't have time for it. So the post-flood world is characterized by worldwide recolonization. This is what has to happen, right? The world has been swept clean. The creation language here is deliberate on the part of the author of Genesis, Moses. He wants us to understand that this is an event in which the entire slate was wiped and we must start over. It is a new creation in the sense, not that God is... Well, Mark Twain is rumored to have said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And that is the way that the flood narrative is. It borrows heavily from all of the themes in the chapters right before it and reworks them to show you we are starting completely over again. Nothing from the world before, except for what was taken, will continue. That's a key for us. So, created kinds are a topic that creationists like to talk about. And we have a special word that we use. We call it baramin. My sister looks at this and says, why do scientists do this to language? Right? We take two perfectly good words and we smash them together and we put an ology at the end to say that we're studying something, and there you have it. Well, created kinds, we talk about this in creation geology and biology and paleontology of baraminology. Baraminology comes from the Hebrew words bara, which is God's word of creation. When God says, in the beginning God created, that is bara. And in the Hebrew Old Testament, the word bara is only ever used with God as the subject. You and I do not create. Not with this word. God does this. And he does so for physical things as well as intangible things. When the psalmist David says, "Create in me, O God, a new heart," he's saying, bara, make something new. Only you can do this. But Frank Marsh, a biologist and a young earth creationist, introduced this idea of a baramin, a created kind, in 1941. And it's a creationist approach to discovering groups. It recognizes continuity within the kind, so that we're not saying that God created each and every individual species that has ever lived as a separate thing. Because I can look at zebras and I can look at equus as horses and go, those look pretty similar. They're probably part of the same kind. Well, how would we know that? Right? That's a hypothesis. How do you go about testing it? Well, we have a variety of means. So what we can think of is that evolutionary theory says that there is one singular tree of life, or bush of life, in which we start off with the original things that came out of the primordial soup, and over time we evolve into all of these different forms of life. Creationists don't think in terms of a single tree, we think in terms of orchards. We think of orchards of kinds, and in those kinds there is the capacity to produce new species that are variations on the kinds. They're plays on the notes and the themes of the music of a kind, right? Just like a good jazz pianist is going to keep bringing you back to this one thing that he does, that little hook. God's got hooks in here, but in the midst of that, there's also fantastic play and diversity that can happen. So we don't want to think in terms of even a dinosaur kind, right? I've got a dinosaur up over here, a good old Triceratops, North American dino. Triceratops is just one genus in which there are dozens and dozens of horned dinosaurs, dozens of them. And they're wild. They're so wild. We've got lots of different types of mushrooms out there. I doubt there's a single fungus kind. So it's the job of creation biologists, or in the case of the fossils, the paleontologists, to try and figure out what those are. So let's think about this. It appears, at least from our research so far, that many of the organisms, the level of the kind, at least for things like vertebrate animals, seems to be somewhere around the level of that biological family. Some of you are in biology classes now, and you've gone, oh, no, not that. Don't worry. King Philip came over for great spaghetti, and we're all happy for it, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. It actually gets far more complicated from this because we have words like infraclass and superorder and subfamily and tribes. But nonetheless, we'll just stick with this. From what we've been able to recognize so far, the family is close to kind of average in where the kind seems to be, whether we're looking at animals and their mating capabilities with others. So for example, we've got cats, lots of cats. There's 60 species of cats alive on the planet today. 60! Most of them are little small things living in South America and Africa. They're about the size of your house cat, but they're different, right? But of course, we got things like lynx, and we got panthers, and we got pumas, and we got lions, and tigers, and not bears, right? Not bears, different kind. Well, it turns out that through selective breeding experiments, we can recognize that actually all of the different cat species on the planet are likely able to be united through a web of interconnected breeding. That doesn't mean that little Mr. Bits, our first house cat, Mr. Bits. Mr. Bits and Leo are not going to have a child, right? Leonetta, right? They're not going to have a child. They can't. But little Mr. Bits can mate with this other, wild small cat, which can mate with these other wild small cats, which eventually can mate with that lynx, and that lynx is actually able to mate with some other bobcats that mate with mountain lions, and those mountain lions are able to mate actually with cheetahs, which is really weird, and everything's actually kind of connected. That's really strange, especially if the Earth is supposed to be incredibly ancient. Why is it that 60 different species who have been evolving on their own trajectories for at least the past few millions of years as cats, why would they retain the ability to interbreed with one another so frequently? If the Earth is recent and these species are more recent from the Ark-born cats that were brought on board, this makes more sense to me as to why they can all interbreed with one another. So 2 of every kind was brought on board the Ark, and possibly 7 pairs. The Hebrew is not clear on that. But after the flood is over, it's these animals that are going to repopulate the world. So many of the species that we see alive today are probably not the species that Noah brought on board the Ark. And yet every picture book you've ever had shows you modern animals on the Ark. Noah's Ark goes to the zoo, collects everything, including the giraffes, and the cartoonists always make fun of the snails or something else, right? Yeah, come on, really? But it does mean that many new species arise from these original Ark-born parents during the post-flood period. And so those cats, those dogs, right? Here we've got 2 different dogs that are part of the same species, Canis familiaris, just a domestic dog. One of them you can ride like a horse. The other one I don't think qualifies as a dog anymore. This is the fall. This is sin, people. I don't care if you remember anything out of this talk except for this one thing. Never, ever own a dog that can be beaten up by any respectable cat. Just not right. Something wrong in the world. That apple. No, anyway. So, I worked on a study of this with one of my students at Liberty University. We were partnering with Answers in Genesis as they were thinking ahead for the Ark Encounter exhibit that they created, right? That a huge thing. And I was tasked with my student of going through and taking a look at all of the fossil groups that might have gone on the Ark. And then adding those to any of the living groups as well. And combined, our project showed that somewhere, if we took the family as the approximate thing that was brought on board the Ark, then there would be about 938 kinds that were brought on board the Ark. That's a lot, 1,000, 2,000 animals, give or take. But look at those numbers on the side, right? If we used something like living species, well, there's over 1.4 nearly million species on Earth. If we want to make sure that we capture and catch all the beetles and whatnot, that's the animals that could conceivably go on board the Ark. I'm not sure that they all did. Kind of up to God what to do with bugs. But that's way too many, right? How many arks does the Bible tell us that we have? Just one. We have one ark. Previous studies in the 1990s had said, maybe as many as 8,000 if we looked at genera, but that number has, the number of genera that we know, especially from the fossil record, has gone up significantly since that. And I would say that the genus is no longer a viable candidate for us, but the family is. So let's look at an example of what might happen in the post-flood world, looking at a family of animals where we have some familiarity, and that is modern horses. Well, modern horses are part of a big family called the Equidae. Right? Equus is the name of the genus, and Equidae means the family. And it turns out that there's more in the family than just common horses, donkeys, and zebras. If we go back in the fossil record, we see some other sorts of things in it that are weird little horses. And I mean weird little horses. Weird little horses with 3 toes in their front foot and 4 toes in the back. But wouldn't you know, the big middle one has a little hoof. Cute, it's adorable. The one down at the bottom there, you can see, number 1, it's about the size of a German Shepherd, which is a good-sized dog, but not a good horse. And it was a tiny little thing that would have lived in forests, not open grasslands. It had teeth that were designed for chewing soft leaves, whereas modern horses have these gigantic, deep-rooted teeth that are all crenulated and wrinkly on the top as they eat high silica content grasses. Grasses are hard. They are really hard because they actually grow in them basically little crystals of quartz called phytoliths, and those act to grind down the teeth. But if you eat leaves, you don't run into phytoliths, so you can have much softer teeth and less deep roots for them. And that's what we actually see in this fossil series. Now, a lot of times young Earth creationists in the past said, they criticized this fossil horse series a lot and said the evolutionists are making these things up, or like this doesn't work this way. Actually, it really does. But I think what it's showing us is what happened to the kind caught in snapshots of geological catastrophes in the centuries after Noah's flood. And that Noah's horses that he brought on board the ark would look radically weird compared to the horses later on by the time we get to Abraham. And you're like, really? Yeah. That in the post-flood world, as they were fruitful and multiplied, not only did they multiply in number, but they multiplied in form, while at the same time retaining enough of it that I can look at it as a paleontologist. I can study their skulls, I can look at their teeth, I can look at their feet, I can look at their hands, I can look at their toe bones and go, this is horse. It's not any horse I've seen alive today, but this is still definitely horse. In the Ice Age, at the very top of this unit, we see that a lot of the different groups of mammals tended to get pretty big. And why is that? Right? We don't see lizards getting really big in the post-flood world. If I've got my idea in geology what the post-flood world is looking like correct, we don't see massive lizards in the age of mammals stuff. But we do see horses, like this one, going from these little guys eventually up to draft horses and stuff like that, big things that you can ride. Herding animals. I don't know if the little horses were herders or not. Probably they were, because they were behaviorally pretty similar to like tiny deer. So they probably would have been running around in small family units. But nonetheless, there's this weird trajectory of going from small and eating leaves to big and eating grasses and running out in the open. And a lot of different organisms go from something that seems to be pretty small the first time we see members of their family, and by the time we get to the Ice Age, we've got big members of it. Why is that happening? What's going on? Well, one of the reasons to think that Noah may have taken on board small members of the kinds is that you can take care of them a lot easier. And you can fit them more easily on the ark. They have to survive an entire year. You need food for all of these things. We tend to think of the ark and we think of all the animals that go on. Have you ever thought that they needed some hay? A lot of hay? Maybe they were towing a barge behind them? I don't know. Right? But no, God said actually provisions go in the ark for the animals and for you. It seems that during the post-flood period, we see this trajectory going from small to big in a whole bunch of different sorts of things. So there seem to be two factors going on. And here's, pictures of some of your classic Ice Age mammals with a shadowed human for comparison. You got your Smilodon, the saber-toothed tiger. You've got this glyptodon here called Glyptotherium. It's basically a gigantic armadillo. And when I say basically, I mean it's actually like in the same family as the armadillos. It's just really stinking big. Over on the far side, you have a beaver that stood 4 feet tall. Can you imagine the size of the dam that he could make? Especially out here with your trees. I mean, man. But yeah, we have this thing called Paleocaster, not Paleocaster, but Castorides, Gigantocaster. Anyway, it's like this giant beaver. It's 4 feet tall. How do they get big and why? Well, one of the reasons why is something called Cope's rule. This is an image of Edward Drinker Cope, who was a famous paleontologist in the 1800s. He and another paleontologist by the name of Marsh had a long-standing, bitterly hatred feud with each other that resulted in most of the dinosaurs and mammals of North America being discovered and named by these guys in a massive ego competition that literally drove other people out of the field and resulted in deaths because, these guys were bad. Anyway, never mind. Yale's fine now. So he was an American paleontologist in the 1800s, and he noticed this trend among these Cenozoic mammals, that they started off small and they tended to get big. And he thought that basically this was something that happened almost irrespective of environment, that there was just this kind of tendency for organisms to get bigger. And there's some interesting reasons why, that even without changes in the environment, getting bigger has its advantages. But I'll get to that in a moment. Another biologist in Germany, by the name here of Bergman, he noticed that members of similar species, or even the same species that lived in alpine areas, tended to be bigger than the ones that lived below the alpine regions. So if you had two mountain goats that are up in the alpine areas where it's cold all the time were just physically larger than the same species further down the mountain. So his observation does seem to be tied to environment. Cold gets big, whereas Cope also recognized that as you go through lineages, big just happens. So why? Well, there's some advantages to being big. Here we've got an elephant and a mouse as examples. Mammals that we're familiar with. Both of them, of course, are mammals. They are warm-blooded organisms. If you stuck a thermometer in their mouth, you'd register somewhere around 98 degrees. It actually varies from one mammal species to the next as to how hot or cold that is. Coldest temperatures, sloths. They're sitting at about like 89, 90. I mean, you'd think they'd be dead, and you're close to right? It's just not a whole lot of action going on there. On the other hand, very small mammals like mice tend to running a little bit hotter. They're closer to 99, almost 100. But all mammals are somewhere in basically the 90s, usually the upper 90s. So these two things are basically running at the same temperature, But have you ever held a mouse in your hand? Some of you have, yeah. And others are like, no, Dr. Ross, not happening. That's why we have traps. Yes. But if you've ever held a mouse in your hand, you just hear, you feel that heartbeat. It's going like crazy. And of course, that's because the mouse is going, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. But even without that, the mouse's heart beats fast, super fast. Chipmunks, most neurotic animal on the planet. Heartbeat like crazy. Elephant, put your hand up to an elephant and touch it, thump, thump, thump. It's way slower. You're like, dude, you okay? They're fine. It's easier to thermoregulate. If you're a warm-blooded organism, it's easier to maintain your temperature when you're big. The reason the heart of that mouse is going so fast is because it has to keep metabolizing. It has to make heat. It's losing heat too fast. It has thick fur. What does the elephant not have? Thick fur. Why? Because it's got a gigantic barrel-shaped body that kicks out a lot of heat. And if you live in the African savannah, you need big ears to get rid of it too. Slower metabolism relative to your body size. You get to be metabolically lazy when you're big. You don't have to eat as much per body weight, right, per kilogram. You still eat more than everything else, but you eat less per unit weight. If you scaled a mouse up to the size of an elephant and it still had to eat as much as it did, it would enormous volumes of food. Can't do it. You also get better protection from predators. The bigger you are, the fewer things can get you. So there is ecological pressure to be bigger, to favor just in one litter things that grow faster and grow bigger. They'll be better protected from other sorts of things. So in the world after the flood, it might have looked something like this. Like I said, it was familiar, almost like today, but not quite. The Atlantic was still spreading, possibly. Would have been huge swaths of land that were still underwater, even though Noah's flood was done. Noah's flood is done when Noah gets off the boat, God tells him. But that doesn't mean that the modern world is where we're at, right? That's an assumption that we bring to the table because we're modern people and we know what our globe looks like, right? It's the same way that we know that Adam was a white guy created by a big white guy on the Sistine Chapel, right? We view the past through the lens of ourselves, sometimes to our detriment. So we want to open up our thinking. We want to open up the way that we consider the past by saying, okay, the things that I've always thought that it was, do I have good reason to think that? And if yes, then that's fine. But are there other things where we say, well, we have some options out on the table? So I mentioned the Ice Age. As we get towards the higher up in these units, animals are getting bigger and things like that. Well, that's in part because overall, one of the big trends that we have in the post-flood world is that the world is getting drier and cooler after the flood. Drier makes sense, right? It's just that everything was wet. Everything was underwater. But after the flood is done, the world is still reeling from the effects of the flood. The oceans are warm, probably kicking out a lot of precipitation. And over time, these engines start to slow down a bit. And so, my good friend Scrat joins me, right, for the Ice Age, right? The Ice Age is a late post-flood event. Some creationists think that it's shortly after the flood. I would say a little bit longer after the flood, but nonetheless, all of us are pretty much in agreement that there was an ice age sometime after the flood, and we define the ice age by continental glaciers covering significant parts of North America, Greenland, of course Antarctica, large parts of Europe and Asia, and big mountain glaciers coming off of places like the Himalayas, the Andes. Out over here we had significant glaciers coming down as well. But the big continental sheets were out where I grew up in Rhode Island. Rhode Island had all of its fun geology that had dinosaurs scraped off and dumped into the Atlantic somewhere. Which is why I went to South Dakota. But anyway, got to find me some dinosaurs. So if this is the post-flood period, the Ice Age is way up at the top of it. So we have some time in between the flood and the Ice Age in which these organisms are changing within their kinds, but the overall trends are towards a world that is getting cooler and drier and more grasslands, and so we're seeing the adaptability that God built into these organisms unfold. This is what the world's globe would have looked like, more or less, during the glacial maximum. So here's a standard globe as we're used to seeing it, and here's a view from the North Pole. And you can see it's a nice ring, right? This isn't random. This is as far down as the ice got. So we have a tendency to think that the Ice Age meant there was ice everywhere. If you lived in the equator, it was fine. It was hot. It's the equator. It's always hot. Even during the Ice Age, it's always hot. It might have been a few degrees cooler than it is now, but if you were in my home state of Rhode Island, you wouldn't know anything about that because you'd be standing on a big pile of ice or under it. So how did the Ice Age happen? Well, after the flood, we have very warm waters that are resulting in high rates of precipitation. And in the interior parts of the continents, that precipitation eventually starts coming down as snow. We also have a lot of volcanic activity. The Cascade Mountains that you guys live in, and I get to fly over and go, oh my goodness, those are big hills, right? Oh, I'm with the Appalachians. Kind of runty. I get to see these. Most of these mountains are post-flood mountains. They erupted either at the end of the flood or into the post-flood period. As the transition started to shift from dominantly rain everywhere to rain in the south or in the central equatorial regions and snow starting to build up, that started actually a feedback reaction. Right? If I was walking here with this microphone and I came too close to another speaker, what would happen, right? That's right. And it squeals because the speaker picks up the amplified part of my voice and kicks it back into the microphone, which then gets blared out over here, which then hits bad notes, right? And we call that feedback. That's actually what we would call a positive feedback loop. The initial change, slight increase in volume, gets amplified until all of a sudden we're like, this is terrible. There's negative feedback reactions, and that's when if you push down on something, something pushes back on the other side. Negative feedback mechanisms try to balance stuff. Positive feedback mechanisms cycle up whatever change you made. So if it starts getting cold and you're in a positive feedback mechanism, well, we get some snow that reflects light, which reduces the temperature in the local area because we're not absorbing as much light from the sun. We're bouncing it back out. Well, cooler temperatures will allow more snow to fall, which means we're going to have more snow cover, which means we're going to reflect more light, which means we're going to depress the temperatures even further, which means that snow is going to start covering more and more and more and more and more and more and more, until you end up with, this. But positive feedback mechanisms can't survive forever. They can only keep going as long as there is energy input to make them happen. But sooner or later, they run into a system that forces them to hit the brakes. And sooner or later, the temperatures in the interiors get so cold that lots of snow can't fall anymore. I don't know if any of you have lived in a place where it can get so cold that it can't snow. My wife comes from South Dakota. It can be so cold that it cannot snow. Oh yes, those temperatures exist. They're like Dante's 8th level of hell and further down, and that's, the 9th level is Saskatchewan. It's not far from the truth, folks. So sooner or later, what happens to this system is that it runs out of fuel in terms of snow, and then the snow starts melting at the edges. The glaciers start to melt off, and that allows more land to be exposed, which means you warm up that part of land, which allows that area to be a little bit warmer, and the backwards system starts to go back, and you lose your glaciers. We keep some of them in some place. So that's what's going on. Glaciers always move in one direction, downhill. Which is really weird because actually they can go over hills. Which means that if you want a glacier to always go downhill but also run over a hill, it means that the hill of ice has actually got to be taller than the hill that you're trying to run over. And that was the case. We had 2 miles of ice in Canada. And by the time you get to the Atlantic seaboard, that means that that ice is actually able to flow over a whole bunch of mountains. Yeah, pretty wild. So you can actually get ice. You can't get water, but you can get ice to go uphill. You just need a bigger hill. So the accumulated snow piles up, gravity pushes the ice mass forward. Melting happens at what we call the terminus of this, and a glacier will advance or retreat based on the balance point between how much snow is coming in and how much melting is happening. So we talk about a glacier retreating, but really what we mean is it's melting faster than the new ice is coming forward. Glaciers never move backwards. They only melt fast. And when glaciers surge forward, it's because there's a whole bunch of ice that moves faster than melting can happen. So as the glaciers grew, sea level also fell. Ocean water basically got locked up in gigantic ice cubes that we call glaciers. And that means that the water from that ocean, as it drops, exposes big areas of land as far as 400 feet below current sea level. So during the peak ice age, I'm going to bring this image back up. Look at Florida. Florida looks kind of weird. Oops. Wrong one. There we go. I can actually zoom in. Sweet. Right? There's the Yucatan Peninsula looking a little fat. And then there's like this other thing. Where'd that come from? That's not that far deep under the water off the coast of Central America. And that was all exposed land during the Ice Age. This little corridor, oops, hold on, I gotta get my laser pointer. There we go. This little corridor, right through here, this is where people came into the Americas. When the First Nations made it over here, they were following bison herds and mastodons and mammoths that didn't really know that they were going to another continent because it was just all land. And they were following the migration paths. And people came down that way, and some of them came down probably on an ice-free path right next to the Pacific. A lot of that's still kind of up in the air as to how it happened. But this is one way late in the post-flood world that animals got around. But there were other ways before that as well. So, in quick summary here, let's see. This area of connection, what we call Beringia, the Bering Strait, turn that into land, we call it Beringia, is what allowed Ice Age mammals to travel between continents, mammoths, mastodons, bison. We talk about the American bison. It's Asian. That's an Asian bison. It was just in America by the time the Europeans came to it. They're like, oh, it's an American bison. Yep, sure enough. Like most things, we got it from China. You know. Saber-toothed tigers, classic North American animal. Yeah, it's got relatives in mainland Asia. Humans followed those migration paths to North America. North America was human-free for a good chunk of the post-flood period, and then eventually we found our way here, as we always do. We are still right now actually technically in an ice age. We are in what geologists call an interglacial period, or a period in between major glaciations, but the fact that we still have a giant ice sheet over Greenland and over Antarctica means geologically we would still consider ourselves part of an ice age or a world in which there's ice. Global temperatures are cooler now than they were in most of the post-flood and especially the early post-flood world. But the climate now, mercifully, is far more stable than it probably was during the early post-flood period. That time right after the flood was dangerous. It was blessed by God. Animals had to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But if we're right about what we think is going on, there was a lot of geological catastrophes that were still happening. It wasn't destroying the whole world. And God promised he never would. But all the geological catastrophes that happen around today are reminders of that one that he did do, right? God promised, and he's kept that promise. But we still live with the reverberations of it, just like we live with the reverberations of all the sin that has ever happened, whether we did it or not, right? So we live in a fallen world. We live in a world that is interesting and different from the world that Adam knew. It's different from the world that Noah knew, such that you come out there and you start wondering, like, where am I? What is this place? What's it going to be like? I don't know, but God blessed us and said, be fruitful and multiply. He's telling us we can do this again. And I'm never going to flood the earth again. I'm never going to destroy it this way. And I'm going to eventually send that seed that was promised in that third chapter, the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. That promise goes through Noah before it gets through anybody else. And we are blessed to have lived in a time where we saw that seed in history come in, and we get to tell people about that. But we also live in that interesting period in between two catastrophes, the one that happened and the one that will. So thank you all very much. With that, we can take some questions. And I believe we'll have somebody with a microphone. Heinz is right over there. And while he's getting ready, just point, I was asked to mention something about Cornerstone Educational Supply. So up at the top of this time scale is that name. That's the company my wife and I started a couple of years ago. It's a science supply company. She likes to say we're the stuff people. So when your curriculum says go get some stuff and do some science, we have the stuff. You need a dead frog? I'm your man. You need beakers and glassware, I can help you with that too. But I'm really excited about the frogs and geology kits. So we brought along a few items out on the back. We also have a couple of books that I can recommend. One called Fossils in the Flood, written by Paul Garner, a geologist. It's the one book on fossils from a creation perspective that I actually really endorse. I think it's fantastic. I think that it orients our thinking about things really well and talks about how the flood created the record that we have. Also, there is one book that was just published that I brought along that has me talking about Adam and a historical Adam. As Heinz mentioned, I'll be talking about that in another church coming up on Saturday with a mini conference. But the short deal with that one is it's a multiple views book. You have 4 different Christians with different views as to what to do with Adam, anywhere from Adam is a myth and he didn't ever really exist, to my perspective, Adam lived only a few thousand years ago as part of a young earth creation, and 2 other views in the middle. As one very well-known Old Testament theologian said, I appreciate his words, he said, this is probably the best defense of young earth creationism I've ever read. And this is a man who worked with John Whitcomb. And I thought, wow, that's pretty big praise for those of us who know that name. So with that, we have 2 folks with microphones. So
if you have a question, put up your hand. I see a few questions here.
Hi there.
You were talking about the elephants. They have big ears to radiate heat, right? Okay, can you explain then the difference between African elephants and Indian elephants? Indian elephants have really small heads and really big ears, and the reverse is an African elephant.
That's an excellent question. And we also have pygmy, another species of elephant as well. And yes, the Indian elephants have very small ears because they actually live along the flanks of the Himalayas in a much cooler subtropical environment. And so they're a smaller elephant overall than the African elephants are. And the climate is actually a lot cooler. So they don't need the large ears that the African elephant does. The African elephant is constantly beating those ears and pumping blood into the ears to cool down. The Indian elephants don't need that, and so their ears are smaller. So great question, thank you. Yes, sir?
One over there.
Oh, okay.
Got a question over here.
Over here first?
Do you think that mammoths actually existed? Do
I think mammoths actually existed? Yes.
Do you think that they just lost their hair and became elephants?
Great question. No, that is an excellent question. And the answer actually is elephants certainly did lose their hair at some point, but they didn't lose it from being mammoths or mastodons first. So mammoths, mastodons, and elephants are all different subgroups within this big family of the Elephantidae. And then there's some other elephant families as well that may or may not be part of the same kind. So there might be a couple of different kinds of elephants. But yeah, our woolly mammoths are actually somewhat different species and groups than the modern elephants are. And one of the great ways that we can see that is when we take a look at the tooth batteries that they have. And I say tooth battery because a single elephant tooth is this big, 1 molar. And they erupt moving forward into the jaw so that a little bit of it gets shown, about this much, at any given time in the year. So they actually have their tooth is almost on this conveyor belt type of system of eruption. And that's a different way than some of the other fossil elephant group types of things have. So we can see big differences in the tooth types between elephants and mastodons, gomphotheres, and a bunch of other things. Cool question. Thanks for asking. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so actually, what the liberals think about climate change, and trying to blame it on humanity, is actually that we're still coming out of an ice age.
Yes and no. At least from my perspective as an earth science guy, yes, we are coming out of an ice age, and so we have all these kind of variations and wiggles that have happened in history. We have things like the medieval warm period, where it was actually quite warm from about 900 to 1300 AD. And then we have what's called the Little Ice Age, which if you were to pick the worst possible time to be a pilgrim and cross the Atlantic, 1621, one of the worst. Terrible time. Very, very low temperatures throughout the 16, 17, and into the 1800s. And the end of the 1800s into today, we've been coming out of that cold snap. That said, there are a whole bunch of interesting astronomical features that indicate that we should be in a period of cooling right now, but we're not. We're in a period of warming. So on my own part, and not to jump too far into this, I do think that humanity has had an impact on climate and raising temperatures. What we do policy-wise, in my view, that's a totally different question. The first question is, are we doing anything? And that could be yes, that can be no, that can be I don't know. Any one of those answers is a fair one if the data back it up. I think the answer is yes. We have been forcing, in a sense, just by pumping out a lot of CO2 through these flood-based derived plant materials that we have for fuels, that has been something that has pushed the temperature in a direction that it otherwise wouldn't be going in right now. Now, what do we do about that? That's a totally different question altogether, and I'd prefer not something so drastic that, like, half the world dies. That's a bad plan. Like, no, not that guy. We're not calling Thanos. Good, all right. So I actually wish that some of the issues in climate we didn't split out quite as much between like liberals and conservative views, because we tend to sometimes cross between the data and the policies at the same time. And we have to have a really clear understanding of what the situation is, and then we have to understand that politics, if we believe in von Bismarck's idea, is the art of the possible. So that means not everybody gets a pony. Okay. Yes, sir. Hey there.
I wanted to thank you for coming to talk to us tonight. It was pretty interesting.
Thank you.
I liked it a lot. But growing up, it came to a point when you're in science class, in high school, and you start coming to this realization that you're on like two different sides here. So at a certain point, they kind of say evolution is what got us here, and then some people on the other side are saying, God created the world the way it is and all the animals that live in it. And this kind of just brought almost both mixed together, because it really shows that the kinds of animals, definitely, it wasn't to start, we had all these species that they were pretty basic to begin with, and then we're able to evolve. So it was really interesting.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's one of those things that a lot of times creationists are called by those who aren't in our camp. Like, we believe that God created every species at the beginning. And you're actually really hard-pressed to find a creationist who held to the idea of species fixity in the last couple hundred years, actually, at least a young Earth creationist. Even Carl von Linné, who gave us that whole kingdom, phylum, class, family, sort of system, he started off as a species fixist. He called species for the very reason that the word species in Latin is kind. So when he was reading the Vulgate, right, the Latin version of the Bible, when God created, he created each species. And this is what ended up getting us into this whole issue of like, oh, God created species. Well, Linnaeus wanted to try and discover the created kinds, so he called them species, but then he realized that there was evidence for this interbreeding and cross-pollinization, hybridization in plants especially, threw him for a loop, and he went, wait a minute. By the end of his life, he's like, maybe it's the genus. But by that time, we already had the genus and the species kind of out there, and so this confusion started to bring. So yeah, young Earth creationists have long held that there is the capacity for speciation, but that it is constrained within the boundaries of those kinds in some way. So yeah, I hope that that helps to flesh these things out a little bit, broaden us out. So if somebody says, do you believe in evolution? You can say, well, what do you mean by that? Do you believe that all animals share ancestry with each other? Well, I would say no. But do I believe that God created every individual distinct species? Well, no. No, because after the flood, we have more species and different ones. So thank you.
Question over here.
Yeah.
When we were doing like one of the pictures of like that really tall beaver and like the
Yeah.
mammoth, I saw a picture of the saber-toothed tiger. Do you believe those exist too?
Oh, yes, absolutely they
Or
did.
existed?
Yes, the saber-toothed tigers, we have, technical term here, oodles of skulls and skeletons. In fact, for my parents' Christmas present when I was in my master's program, I actually did a plaster cast of a half Smilodon skull and painted it up for them and whatnot. I did a pretty good job on that one, actually. I did a better job, I think, for the family I was living with, but nonetheless, yeah, they definitely did exist. I've held their teeth. I've been over to the La Brea tar pits, and you can see like plenty of them. La Brea tar pits down in California has got a massive wall with 200 wolf skulls that they had pulled out from there. And that's just some of them. But they put that up there, and you can see all these little variations in the wolf skulls. And again, it's this interesting view of like the kind can be diverse. I know we've got somebody over here, and then we've also got a young man in the back there, just so in case. Oh, okay, we're almost done, out of time.
All right.
I'll be in the back.
Dr. Ross, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
What's the name of the book that you co-authored with the others?
Sure. The book with me in it is called Perspectives on the Historical Adam and Eve.
Okay.
And it's definitely an upper level approach. I delve very heavy into Hebrew and very heavy into actually created kinds as they apply to humans. What is the human kind? And how do we know what else besides our species might be in it? Neanderthals, for example, or others. Are they part and parcel of the human family? Short answer, yes. So thank you. Perspectives on the historical Adam and Eve.
If I could smuggle in my real question in back of that.
Yeah.
So this is new for me. I always came from an old earth background, and I knew you by reputation and credential as you got the chops. I wanted to learn. And this
Thank you.
talk was totally enjoyable. When it comes to the kinds, that would seem to be a rather, accounting for all of life's diversity, a pretty rapid speciation. And you mentioned also there's catastrophic events taking place.
Yeah.
So my initial thought was, wouldn't that disrupt the change? But maybe it's the reverse. Would the catastrophes have helped the environmental factors propelled that kind of speciation in this model?
I think you bring up a very interesting point as I think about it, right? When new ecospaces are opened, what we find is that organisms colonize, and they colonize quickly, and they're able to diversify without the effect of natural selection acting on them. So natural selection is often thought of as kind of like this push and pull with the environment and the organism. But if organisms are able to just spread out into this kind of vast land without competition, then the physical forms and variations that pop up in any given litter of animals don't get selected out because they're not fit or unfit compared to anything else. And so I think that you're right to bring up the idea with these constant catastrophes happening, constant reorganization of the ecological space. This allows organisms to continue to experiment in a sense, not to anthropomorphize them too much, but every time they have those litters and there's weird things in those litters, yeah, well, there's nothing to say that weird doesn't work here. And not weird still works over there, and some other weird works in that area. So yeah, those are some possibilities.
Question over
So
here.
we're getting some guys from the sound saying,
Yeah, I think we got three quick questions, and we'll close it off at that.
Hey, I have a question on the handout here. In the Paleozoic, if there was a lot of sea animals and mollusks and sharks and amphibians, well, maybe not amphibians, but
yeah.
I mean they're in there. But if this was during Noah's flood, why would they be on the bottom layer? Why would they be the first to die? The ones that are seemingly most adapted.
Great question. See you tomorrow, folks. No, So as the waters begin to rise over the earth, if we think about what happens with loose sand and mud flows downhill, right? It goes downward towards whatever low spot it can find. And that's true not only on land, but also in the ocean. So as you start having earthquakes and tsunamis that start stirring up the ocean, they actually are burying ocean creatures before we even get to the land. And so as the floodwaters rise and start destroying land-based ecosystems and eventually pulling them back into the ocean, they're being pulled back into an ocean that is already starting to be layered and stratified with a whole bunch of oceanic ecosystems, probably going from deeper to more shallow. That's one of the kind of overall perspectives that we see in this rock record from the blue up through the green, is kind of a general movement towards more and more terrestrial as we go up. The bottom of the record has gotten almost no terrestrial, like just about zilch. Then you get kind of these transitional terrestrial environments, and then you get more terrestrial and so on. The sea is never gone. The sea is always there. The waters are constantly moving in. But yeah, the sediment is going to move downhill, even if downhill is deep underwater.
Right. Second part of the question, same topic though. Why would there not be modern versions of animals mixed in with them?
That is a very good question, and a far more difficult one for young Earth creationists, to be honest. Why don't we find mammals with the dinosaurs? Let's just put it that way. Why don't we find humans with the dinosaurs? And despite some claims about human artifacts or things like that in the rock record, I've never found any of those to be something that I could corroborate well enough to put my trust in it. So that means that young Earth creationists, especially if you put the flood boundary where I do, I have a problem with why are there no mammals with the dinosaurs? And I don't have a good answer for that, but we're missing an entire whole suite of ecosystems, including the humans. The higher that you put the fossil record up, the flood record up into the fossil record, the more of those mammals you get, and you say, okay, well maybe now we've got all the mammal ecosystems. The one problem that I run into with that, it's a significant part of our discussion about where do we put the flood boundary, is that we end up with a whole lot of animals that end up coming, like if we put the flood boundary just below the Ice Age, something like what's called the Pliocene, that's way up towards the top here. We said that's the end of the flood, and the Pleistocene is the post-flood period. There are scores of animals that seem to cross that boundary that would be, say, North American mammals that would have to be on board the Ark. Their families would get buried here in North America, and eventually they would get off the Ark and come back to live on the graveyards of their dead ancestors that might not have lived in the same environment. You start going, that's weird. Right, technical term again. That's just odd. And if that happens with great frequency, you start saying this is not a good flood boundary. And so what I do notice about the end of the Cretaceous is it is one of the biggest breaks between the types of things below and the types of things above. And I think, okay, that might be telling me something about the recolonization being very different from before, but it does run into that other problem of, okay, why don't I see some of the things that are around here in there? So I'll have to leave it at that.
Okay, one more.
One last question. Thank you all very much for these. These are great.
Hi, my question is about the horses.
Yeah.
You showed like the modern horses at the top.
Yep.
Showing our modern horse, and at the bottom was the little weird tiny one, and then there's those three in the middle.
Yeah.
So, what fossil evidence do we have for the bottom four?
Oh, lots. I keep doing that. Once again, oodles. So if we take a look at these three, Myohippus, Merychippus, and Pliohippus, and they're in the rocks above this first one called Eohippus. I've handled fossils of all of these. When I was in South Dakota, we had a good collection at the museum. I actually had to be able to distinguish Myohippus versus Merychippus on the basis of a partial jaw fragment. That's what we had to be able to do. That's fun. Yeah. Here's half of a jaw. What does it belong to? And we had to be able to get at least a family on anything that they handed to us. And you can do that because mammal teeth are incredibly specific. Incredibly specific. Quick note on that. How many of you have heard of Nebraska Man? It was it was a pig tooth that was thought to be a human fossil, and it was promoted, but very quickly found out to be very wrong. And everybody kind of looks at that and says, boy, you know, the paleontologists are so desperate for evolutionary things to be true. They're so desperate for evolution of apes to mankind that they'll mistake a pig tooth for a human tooth. You ought to look at a pig tooth. It looks just like ours. Oh my goodness, I don't know what God is trying to tell us about that, but nonetheless. Thank you, Heinz.
So we're going to have to bring this together. One last question.
Oh, one last young man. Yes, sir.
Did platypi come from their own animal or from a different animal?
Hey, cool question. Platypi. And we do have fossils of platypi in the rock record, even platypus teeth, which is weird because modern platypi don't have teeth after they're juveniles, but we have adult platypi teeth in the fossil record, like right after the flood. So as far as we can tell, from the rock record that we have, platypi have been platypi for as long as we have fossils of them. But again, slight differences between the platypi around today versus the ones in the past. In this case, the ones alive today might just kind of be a little bit more juvenile in a sense than the ones, they've kind of lost some of their adult features along the way. So yeah, but Perry the platypus, he's got family.
Okay, let's thank him for the presentation and Q&A.